President Trump wins Medal of Life from International Human Rights Group, but fake news media blacks out news. For the first time in the course of his duties, a U.S. President, Donald Trump, declared his solidarity with members of the March for Life, and officially declared that for the U.S. January 22 stands as National Sanctity of Human Life Day. For that humanitarian gesture in defense of moral ethical values and the sanctity of life starting at conception, the institution's International Center for the Defense of Human Life and the Latin Foundation for Human Rights have the honor of awarding President Donald Trump their highest award, the Medal of Life. Don't bother looking for this in the mainstream media, amigos. Best I can do is link it in Spanish. The notice was written by Honorary President of the International Center for the Defense of Human Life Dr. Oscar Elias Bissett. The center, known by its Spanish initial Psi de Vida, is headquartered in Valladolid, Spain. But most of you have never heard of Dr. Bissett, have you, amigos? And yet yes, human rights activist and former political prisoner who suffered tortures, Nelson Mandela never even envisioned in his worst nightmares from his relative country club incarceration in apartheid South Africa. In fact, Dr. Bissett suffered this jailing and tortures just 90 miles from our shores, in a place absolutely lousy with fake news media news bureaus and positively crawling with fake news media reporters. Gosh! What could possibly account for this grotesque disconnect between these dramatic, potentially blockbuster human interest stories on our very doorstep, and the utter silence from all those gallant crusades for the truth? As Columbia Journalism Schools hails its graduates? Gosh! Might such stories have proven displeasing to the totalitarian apparatchiks who bestow the fake news media with their Cuba press bureaus and their journalist visas? It is a wild guess, but just maybe. Dr. Oscar Bissett is also a Presidential Medal of Freedom winner. More fascinatingly still, he is also black. Even more amazingly, he is a foreign Latino human rights activist. With his profile, what odds would Vegas give that the mainstream media would be reporting his every utterance? Indeed, if the medal had been awarded by Obama and his jailers had been an American ally in the Cold War, like South Africa or Pinochet's Chile? Alas. Bissett's Medal of Freedom was awarded by a Republican President, Bush II, and his jailers and torturers are the regime co-founded by the left's premier pin-up boys, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Any more questions regarding the media blackout on this human rights hero? More specifically, the anti-communist dissident Bissett was jailed and tortured by the Castro regime for peacefully protesting the Stalinist regime's policy of forced late-term abortions via the drug Int'l. The umbilical cord was cut, revealed the medical Dr. Bissett back in 1998. And they, the babies, were allowed to bleed to death or they were wrapped in paper and asphyxiated. Not that most of you have ever heard of this abortion policy from the Castro-accredited U.S. media that reports from Cuba. What most of you probably have heard from the Castro-accredited U.S. media from CNN to NBC, from ABC to NPR, from the AP to CBS to the New York Times is that amazingly low Cuban infant mortality rate. That the Stalinist regime's abortion policy plays an enormous role in these, nonetheless bogus, low infant mortality figures is not something the Castro-accredited U.S. media would dare venture to investigate. That Castro accreditation, you see, would suddenly go poof and vanish. Castro's judicial system, lifted from Stalin as it functioned during the Great Terror, sentenced Oscar Bissett to 25 years of prison, of which he suffered 11. He was also honored by Amnesty International as one of its official prisoners of conscience. Not that this has much induced the Castro-accredited U.S. media to ever mention Dr. Oscar Bissett. Cuba's Oscar Bissett suffered longer in Castro's Gulag than Alexander Solzhenitsyn suffered in Stalin's Gulag, and for essentially the same crime. Both Solzhenitsyn and Bissett refused to renounce truth. Live not by lies, famously advised Solzhenitsyn. This inconsistency by the fake news media is reporting on black political prisoners, that is featuring Nelson Mandela, almost exclusively, needs further dramatization. According to anti-apartheid activists, a grand total of 3,000 political prisoners passed through South Africa's Robben Island prison in roughly 30 years under the apartheid regime. Usually about 1,000 were held. These were out of a South African population of 40 million. According to Freedom House, a grand total of 500,000 political prisoners have passed through Castro's various prisons and forced labor camps. At one time in 1961, some 300,000 Cubans were jailed for political offenses. This is out of a Cuban population in 1960 of 6.4 million. A quick punch of a calculator will easily reveal the grotesque disparity in repression between the two regimes. A quick scan of the media will reveal the grotesque disparity of condemnation applied to the relative molehill instead of to the mountain. In 1964, the government of apartheid South Africa sentenced Nelson Mandela to 30 years in prison. Mandela's trial was conducted by an independent judiciary and witnessed